The morning Silas Venner arrived with his papers and his hired men. The cold was the kind that made the breath come blue and visible, and it hung in the air between them like something solid and accusatory. Like the very oxygen had turned against her and could no longer be trusted to warm itself in the lungs of the living, and Maren had woken knowing something was wrong before she heard the horses, had felt it in the way the dog refused to bark and in the particular quality of the silence that comes when the world is holding its breath before delivering something final. Maren stood in the doorway of the cabin with her newborn daughter wrapped against her chest in the wool shawl, the one her mother had woven in Sweden 30 years before, and shipped across an ocean to a land where no one understood what such a thing meant, or why a woman would keep it when there were perfectly good blankets to be had for coin. And the child inside the shawl was so small, so impossibly small at 3 weeks old, that she seemed barely more than an idea, barely more than the ghost of the future that Maren's late husband would never see. And Ingrid had been born into a world that was already shaped by grief because her father had died in the 8th month of her gestation, had died in this very cabin on a cold night in December, when the pneumonia had finally taken what little air his lungs could manage and stopped it completely. The land agent wore spectacles made of wire and glass, and his suit was black and inadequately cut for the territory, and when he held out the papers, his hands were thin as a creek in drought, all sinew and bone, and the blue veins that mark men who do not work with their hands but only with their instruments and their duplicities. And he stood in her cabin as though he owned it already and had only come to evict a previous tenant before moving in himself. Behind him stood 2 men who worked for the county in some vague capacity and who had long ago ceased to question the documents they were sent to enforce. And they looked at the cabin and at Maren and at the infant wrapped in the shawl with the expression of men who are doing work they know to be shameful, but whose shame had calcified into something that felt from the inside of their own conscience like righteousness, and they held their hats in their hands, not out of respect, but out of some residual understanding that they stood in a woman's home, though that understanding seemed to cost them nothing and to change nothing about what they were doing. The papers were written in English in a hand that was neither Maren's late husband's nor any hand she trusted, and though she had learned to read the language in her early years in the territory, moving through the world with the caution of someone for whom English would always be the language of transactions and warnings, the words on those papers seemed to swim and rearrange themselves when she looked at them, seemed to bend toward interpretations that moved away from her like water, like something that had never really intended to hold still in the first place. And she found that she could not quite focus on them because part of her mind was always aware of the baby against her chest and of the baby's breathing and of the baby's small dreams that seemed to move across her face like clouds passing over a pale sky. The land agent's voice was high and without warmth, and he spoke of survey errors and claims that had been filed in an irregular manner, claims that should never have been granted, claims that the territory now recognized as void and without standing, and he spoke of her late husband's failure to maintain the proper paperwork, a failure that had left the land technically speaking unclaimed, and therefore now a matter for the county to administer in whatever manner the county saw fit. And as he spoke, she noticed that his eyes never quite met her own, that they seemed instead to slide away from her face as though her humanity was something his conscience could not quite accommodate, and so had trained itself not to see. She did not argue because there was no point in arguing, and because her daughter was sleeping in the shawl and needed her to be still and not disturbed, and because Marin had learned long ago that the law, as it was written and practiced in this territory, was not a thing that could be fought but only endured and moved against and quietly overcome through the simple act of persisting in one's life, regardless of what the papers said. And she understood with the clarity of someone who has lived outside the protection of an established community that the only real law was the law of weather and hunger and persistence, that the rest of it was just noise made by men who wanted to believe they had power. What she did instead was to ask them, quietly, if she might be permitted to gather her things, and the land agent agreed, because he was not a cruel man in any overt sense, only a bureaucratic one, and bureaucratic cruelty is the most efficient cruelty because it requires no malice and can be executed with perfect composure. And because he had done this many times before and had learned that women, when they understood the game was lost, would move with a speed that was almost admirable, would gather what they needed, and depart as though they were embarrassed at having occupied the land to begin with. So she turned from them and went into the cabin that had been her home for 7 years, and she did not allow herself to weep, because weeping would serve no purpose, and because she was Scandinavian and Protestant and understood that tears were a luxury for people who lived in established communities with witnesses to their suffering and someone to offer them a cup of tea in commiseration, and because she sensed that the land agent was standing in the doorway, watching her, was watching to see if she would break, to see if his narrative of her weakness would be confirmed in the sight of her tears. She gathered what she could carry, which was not much, was almost nothing when weighed against 7 years of life in a single place, was barely a half-day's inventory of the woman she had been when her husband was alive, and she moved through the cabin like a ghost already, collecting only the things that had density and meaning, only the things that mattered. She took her daughter's things first, the small linen wrappings and the 1 extra length of cloth and the tin cup she used to boil water, and she took the Bible that had belonged to her husband's family, a large volume printed in Danish with woodcuts of the martyrs whose sufferings had been thought worth recording, the holy women who had walked into lions and fire and pain without complaint. And she understood, as she held the book, that she was being asked to do something similar, not with lions but with cold, not with fire but with hunger, not with the certainty of martyrdom, but with the very real possibility of quiet, unremarked upon failure. She took his heavy wool coat, which still held the smell of his body, the smell of tobacco and sweat, and the peculiar musk that comes from a man who has worked hard in his life and never quite rid himself of it, and the smell of him hit her suddenly and made her pause for just a moment before she shook her head and continued, and she took her knife, a good knife with a bone handle and a blade she had kept sharp, and her cast-iron pan, the one piece of cookware that she knew could do the work of 5, and a small wheel of cheese wrapped in cloth that she had made from their milk cow's cream just after the baby was born, made when she still believed the milk cow would be hers to keep, and matches in an oilcloth, precious matches that she held to be more valuable than silver, and a flour sack of things that seemed important in that moment, though in the moment itself they seemed like the inventory of a dream she was already forgetting, things that seemed to belong to the woman she had been, not to the woman she was about to become. She tied these things into a pack with the deliberate care of someone who knew that any mistake in the arrangement of the load would make the weight intolerable, and she wrapped the wool coat around her shoulders, because the morning was colder than the inside of the cabin, and because she knew she would be walking and would not be returning, and because the coat was wool and would hold its warmth even when it was wet, and because it smelled of her husband. And right now, that smell was the only anchor to the life she had been living just moments ago. When she came back out, the land agent was waiting with patience. That was itself a kind of contempt. And he handed her a document that declared her no longer the owner of anything that stood on this ground, and she took it and did not read it and did not crumple it, simply held it in her free hand, while the other held her daughter, and the pack lay against her back like the weight of a decision she had not made but was nevertheless going to have to live with. And she understood that the document was meant to be a finality, but that it was instead just the beginning of something, just the first moment of a long and uncertain calculus that she would have to work her way through. The two hired men watched her walk away from the cabin and down the path that led to the hills, and they did not follow her because the law, as they understood it, did not require them to, and because there was something in the way she walked, something in the angle of her shoulders, despite the burden she was carrying, that suggested following her would be add an insult to a situation that was already amply insulted. And because they had seen this particular drama enough times now that they had learned not to look at women's faces when they were leaving, had learned instead to look at the ground and to wait until they had truly gone before returning to the task of counting the inventory of the cabin. She did not look back at the cabin, not because she lacked the courage to do so, but because she was concentrating on the ground in front of her and on the baby against her chest and on the very immediate problem of putting one foot in front of the other in a way that was sustainable and economical of energy, because she understood with the clarity that comes from having few remaining options that she would need to conserve her strength, and that the luxury of sentiment would have to wait until she had secured a place to sleep, and looking back would be a form of sentiment that she could not afford, and that would only weaken her resolve in a moment when her resolve was the only thing that stood between her and the complete dissolution of her life. The path took her up into the foothills, and the wind came harder there, came with a kind of determination that made her duck her head and adjust her pace, came from the north with the particular bite that only a northern wind can carry, and the baby began to cry from the discomfort of the motion and the cold, began to cry with the raw and demanding cry of an infant who knows nothing of patience and who expects the world to respond to her needs with instant obedience. And Marin found herself stopping in the lee of a grove of cottonwoods, where the wind's teeth were less sharp and where the light seemed to pool differently among the pale trunks. And she opened the wool coat and shifted the child to her breast, and the child latched with the fierce hunger that all newborns possess, and that seems out of proportion to their size, as though inside their tiny bodies there lived a much larger appetite, as though Ingrid was drawing not just milk, but also strength and determination, and all of the will to survive that her mother possessed. The milk came easily, and Marin felt it in the old way that women have felt it for centuries, as a kind of release and also a kind of pulling, as though her body was a well and the baby was drawing water from depths she had not known were bottomless, as though the child's hunger was teaching her body to generate milk, faster and richer than she had known was possible. And she sat with her back against the smooth white bark of the cottonwood and let the child feed while she studied the country around her. the rocky ridges and the stands of pine that bent slightly under the weight of the wind, like old women learning to bend with age, the canyons that opened into other canyons, the general sense that the land here was folded and creased, like something that had been torn and only partially reassembled. And she understood that she was in a place where the land did not want to be lived upon, and yet she would have to find a way to live here anyway. Had to find a way that the land itself would permit. When the baby had fed and slept again against her chest, Maren rose and continued walking, and the afternoon lengthened into the gray that comes in winter when the sun seems to be descending from a height that was never very great to begin with, seems to be sinking not in glory, but in resignation, and she was growing worried about shelter, about where the night might be spent, about whether she would have to try to build something from scratch, or whether the land would offer her something to work with, when she saw it rising out of the rocks and bare ground before her. And at first she thought it was a natural rock formation, some kind of outcropping that the ages had worked into shelter. But as she drew closer, she understood that it was the remnants of a human structure, was the blackened stone foundation of a barn that had burned, perhaps a decade ago, perhaps longer, perhaps so long ago that even the memory of it had burned away, was the evidence of someone else's attempt to make a homestead in this country, and the evidence as well of their failure. And she understood in that moment that failure was the most common outcome, and that most people who attempted this life did not succeed, and that she was now joining the company of the failed, though perhaps she might manage to fail more slowly than others had done. The foundation was built of limestone blocks that had been dragged here by oxen and fitted together without mortar, blocks that bore the marks of the tools that had shaped them, and the ground inside the foundation had been cleared long ago of vegetation, had been so thoroughly cleared that no plant had managed to find its way back, despite all of the years that had passed, and scattered across it were the burned remains of timber, wood so charred it was nearly returned to the state of coal, wood that had lain here long enough for the weather to have some opinions about its arrangement, and that had been sorted and resorted by wind and snow and time. But it was not the ruin itself that made Maren stop, was not the evidence of some other woman's or family's failed dream that caught her attention, was instead the steam that was rising in thin columns from between the stones of the foundation, was the visible breath of the earth itself, was the evidence that beneath the ruins there was warmth, was heat, was something that should not exist in this place, but existed nonetheless. And the steam rose and dissipated into the cold air in patterns that seemed almost conscious, seemed almost like the earth was trying to communicate something to her, seemed almost like a message written in a language she did not know but desperately needed to learn. She approached the stones slowly, carefully, the baby still asleep and warm against her chest, and she knelt down and touched the stone and found it warm in the way that a living thing is warm, and the warmth surprised her because she had not expected it, and because it suggested that the heat was not fleeting but constant, that it came from somewhere deep and reliable. And she smelled the air, and it carried with it the scent of sulfur, that ancient and biblical smell that speaks of depths and of fire, and of the earth's intention to keep secrets. And she understood in that moment, with the clarity that comes from desperation and from faith combined, that this place, this ruined place, this failed homestead, was going to be her salvation, because the earth itself had provided a furnace, and she only had to learn to use it. And she knelt there for a long moment and felt the warmth moving up through the stone into her knees and her legs, and understanding that this warmth was the only thing that stood between her and the long process of dying that winter would otherwise impose upon her. She spent the rest of the afternoon clearing the worst of the burned timber from the interior of the foundation, dragging it piece by piece with hands that were already growing cold despite the warmth of the stones, to form a rough wall at what she decided would be the back of her shelter. And she found that the warmth increased as she got closer to the center of the foundation, found that there were actually two distinct vents where the hot water was seeping up and creating dark, wet patches in the ground, found that if she laid her palm on the earth near these vents, the heat rose through her skin and into her blood and made her believe, for the first time since the land agent had arrived at her door, that she might actually be going to survive this, that she might be going to keep her daughter alive, that the two of them might manage to persist through the winter and into the spring and beyond. And the thought was so powerful and so unexpected that it made her lightheaded. She gathered the longer pieces of charred timber, the ones that had not been completely reduced to ash, and she fashioned a rough roof across one corner of the foundation using pieces of slate that had somehow emerged from the ground over the years, layering them over the timber in the way she remembered seeing done in a root cellar in Minnesota, the way that creates shelter while allowing air to move through so that the air inside does not grow stale and poisoned. And she worked quickly, because the light was beginning to go and because she knew that night would come with a temperature drop that would be severe and immediate. She found a place near the warmest vent, a space where the ground was nearly hot enough to be uncomfortable to kneel on, and she arranged pieces of burned wood in a rough circle around it, and then filled the circle with dead grass that she found in a protected place on the lee side of the foundation, dead grass that had been growing among the stones for years, and that had preserved a kind of warmth when she crumpled it in her hands. And she made a bed of this material and laid her daughter on it, wrapping her in the wool shawl so that she was contained and held and protected. And Ingrid slept through the early evening and into the night without stirring, slept the sleep of an infant who does not yet understand that sleep and death are different states. And Maren sat with her back against the foundation wall and held her daughter and felt the warmth rising from the earth and understood that she had been given a gift that was not meant to be there and that therefore might be taken away at any moment, and that she would have to move quickly to make use of it, and that she would have to be smart and careful and ruthless in her use of this advantage, because the advantage was not a guarantee, was only a possibility, and possibility was not the same as certainty, and certainty was what she would need to keep both of them alive. The nights were long in February in the Dakota Territory, and the stars came out with a particular brightness that seemed to have nothing to do with the cold that was settling over the land like a blanket made of lead. And Maren sat through the night not really sleeping, but not really awake either, in that state between consciousness and dream that comes from exhaustion and from exposure and from the particular hypervigilance that comes when one is responsible for the survival of something more fragile than oneself. And she thought about her husband, who had died 2 months earlier from the pneumonia that comes to the high plains without warning and takes people with sudden efficiency, taking them in the night when they are sleeping. And she thought about the baby who had been born into a world that already did not want her, and that had now made that rejection official through the medium of fraudulent paperwork and the authority of bureaucracy. And she thought about the fact that she was 42 years old and had thought her life was settling into a shape it would keep, had thought she would spend her remaining years as the wife of a man who was learning to farm this difficult land. And now the shape had been unmade, and she would have to find a new one or create one from whatever materials the earth provided, and the task seemed simultaneously impossible and inevitable. And she understood that she would accomplish it not through bravery or special strength, but through simple persistence and the refusal to accept any narrative other than the narrative of survival. When morning came, gray and cold and indifferent as morning is in winter, gray in the way that winter gray can be, a gray that seems to have leaked from the very stones in the very sky, Maren rose with the baby and found that the warmth from the spring had kept them both alive and warm, had preserved them through a night that would have killed them in any other place. And she understood that what she would have to do was construct a more permanent shelter, had to build walls and a roof that would last through spring and into summer, had to map the boundaries of this thermal zone that existed for no reason that she could understand, but which would be the difference between her survival and her death. And that understanding came with a weight of responsibility that was almost crushing. Over the next weeks, she worked with the methodical dedication of someone who knows that the alternative to action is death, and that therefore, action, no matter how difficult, is actually the easier path, is actually the only path, and she moved through the work with the focused attention of someone for whom there could be no rest, no respite, no moment of letting attention slip. She gathered fallen wood from the forest around the ruin, dragged it back to the foundation with Ingrid in the sling against her chest, and using her knife and a fire that she maintained from matches and dry wood she had processed, she cut pieces to size and began to construct walls. Low walls, because she understood that the lower the structure, the easier it was to heat, and the more efficiently the warmth from the earth could be captured and held, and because she had seen how the wind moved over the land, and knew that walls that rose too high would catch it and funnel it and turn the inside of her shelter into something cold. She used the charred timber from the old barn as part of this construction, the wood that had already been tempered by fire, and therefore had a particular integrity and strength, and she fashioned a door from a sheet of bark that she found and that was large enough to cover the opening, and she made hinges from willow branches woven together and twisted to create something that could hold the weight, and the branches held, because willow is flexible and strong, and because she had learned, in the 7 years of her marriage, how to work with natural materials in the way that the land permitted. She kept the baby in the sling against her chest while she worked, the baby who slept through most of the work and who seemed to understand that her mother's hands needed to be free, and the baby grew fat on her milk, grew healthy in the warmth that the spring provided, grew in a way that seemed almost miraculous, given the circumstances of her birth and the strangeness of the place where she was being raised, grew with a robustness that seemed to defy the logic of the situation. Maren discovered that the spring had multiple vents, that the warmth wasn't confined to a single spot, but rather seemed to seep up from a larger area beneath the foundation, seemed to come from somewhere deep in the earth that she could not see and could not fully understand, and she began to understand the shape of this invisible geography, the way the heat moved through the ground, the places where it was strongest, and the places where it faded into the general cold of the territory. And she took to spending time just lying on the warm stones, feeling the heat move up through her body, feeling it restore something in her that had been being leached away by months of grief and loss and fear. She dug a shallow channel with her knife and pieces of flat stone, creating a way for the hot water to run without pooling, creating a system that allowed her to use the water without being scalded by it. And she used this running water for bathing, for washing the baby's cloth wrappings in a way that would have been impossible in any other circumstance, for preparing food. And she understood that she had been given access to a luxury that most people in the territory would never have, that she was living in the midst of a kind of abundance that was disguised as deprivation, and that the world, which had seemed to be organized entirely against her survival, had instead provided her with the one thing that she needed most. In the third week, when the baby was sleeping through most of the night, and when the shelter had begun to take a more permanent shape, when the walls had risen to the height of her waist, and when the roof was becoming something that actually provided shelter rather than merely the idea of shelter, Maren walked down from the hills to the town of Pine Bluff, which lay in a valley not 3 miles from the ruin, and which she had always avoided in the time of her marriage, because her husband preferred to trade with a post 2 days' journey away, and which she had never entered on her own until now, had never had need to enter because her husband had always been the one to do the trading. She needed salt, and she needed flour, and she needed the smaller things that one cannot manufacture from what the earth provides, and so she made the walk in the early morning with the baby still in the sling and with a small pouch of coins that her husband had left and that she had hidden from the land agent because the law, as it was written, had not technically taken her coins. Only her land had not anticipated that a woman's desperation might extend to the hiding of small metal objects in unlikely places. The town was small and rough-built, a collection of structures that seemed to have been assembled without much thought to permanence, and the people on the street when she walked through seemed to her like people everywhere, seemed to people who are living outside the ordinary world, like they were performing a kind of theater that they did not quite believe in, like they were going through the motions of being human, but with the sense that the performance was always temporary and always subject to cancellation. She found the general store and purchased what she needed, moving quickly, not looking at the proprietor's face, understanding from the quality of his silence that he recognized in her something that his experience had taught him to distrust or pity, or perhaps some confusion of both. And she understood that her appearance, her clothes that had belonged to her husband and were too large for her frame, her copper-red braid that had come loose from its pins, her hazel-green eyes that had the particular gleam that comes from exhaustion and fear combined, marked her as someone from outside the community, someone who did not belong to the ordinary structures that govern things. It was when she was leaving that she encountered Mrs. Verity Dunlap, the wife of the preacher, a woman whose position in the community gave her the right, as she understood it, to have opinions about other people's lives and to express those opinions without the filter that common courtesy might suggest, and who seemed to believe that the expression of judgment was itself a form of charity. Mrs. Dunlap stood in the street with her gloved hands folded before her and her hat decorated with feathers that must have come from some bird that had never lived in the territory and could not have survived there, and she looked at Maren and said, in a voice that carried the particular cruelty of someone who believed that cruelty was actually kindness dressed up for public consumption, that she had heard what had happened to her, that she had heard she was living out in the ruins like an animal, that surely she did not think that was a suitable place to raise a Christian child, that the baby would grow up wild and uncivilized and damaged. Maren did not respond to this, did not engage with the woman's concern or her judgment, only shifted the baby in the sling and continued walking, continued moving with the kind of determination that comes from understanding that engagement would be pointless. But she heard Mrs. Dunlap calling after her, heard her saying that it was shameful, that it was ungodly, that no decent woman would choose to live as she was living, that she was endangering the soul of her infant daughter with such depravity. And Marin understood in that moment, with the clarity that comes from having been forced to understand many things in a very short time, that the town would not help her, that the town's understanding of decency and of God's will was not something that she could trust or depend upon, and that the only help that would come to her would come from the earth itself, from the warm stones and the steam and the small circle of heat that the spring provided, and that this was perhaps not a bad thing, was perhaps even a kind of mercy, because it meant that she did not have to negotiate with anyone else's understanding of how she should live, did not have to defend her choices to people who would never understand them. She walked back to the ruin as the afternoon descended toward dusk, and the baby was sleeping in the sling, and her arms ached from the walk and from the weight she carried, ached in the way that bone aches when it is being asked to work beyond its capacity, and yet continues anyway because the alternative is unthinkable. And the sky above her turned colors that seemed to belong to another world, colors that seemed too beautiful to be wasted on a place so harsh and so indifferent, colors of rose and blue-gray that spoke of light being fractured and scattered in ways that were almost miraculous in their beauty. And she understood that she would have to make peace with this beauty, would have to accept it, even as she made no peace at all with the harshness, and that the path forward was going to require a kind of double vision, an ability to see both the cruelty and the grace in a single place, and to move forward as though both were true, because of course they were both true. And that was the thing about the territory and about the life she was now going to have to live, that it would always be like this, would always require her to hold two contradictory truths at once and to act from the still point that exists between them, and that perhaps this was the only true religion available to those who lived in such places, the religion of accepting what could not be changed and of working patiently with what remained, and of understanding that beauty and cruelty could coexist in the same moment and the same place without canceling each other out. And so she built day by day through the waning days of autumn, when the light grew thin and copper-colored and seemed to emanate from the earth itself rather than descend from the sky, when the temperature at dawn would be a revelation of how quickly the air could chill once the sun withdrew its meager offering, her hands growing raw from the stone and then calloused in the manner of hands that have accepted their portion of hardship, her forearms becoming muscled and capable as she worked the salvaged stones from the collapsed barn walls into new configurations, stacking them without mortar, trusting in their weight and the ancient logic of stone upon stone that had endured since before the arrival of men with papers and claims, her arms burning as she carried timber beams from the wreckage and fashioned a framework for the roof that would sit low and close to the ground, like a burrow, like something that had grown from the earth rather than been built upon it. And she worked with Ingrid strapped to her back in a sling fashioned from an old shirt, the baby sleeping through the exertion, lulled by the motion and the proximity to her mother's body. And during these hours, Marin felt the strange communion of work and motherhood simultaneously, felt the weight of her daughter and the weight of timber in her arms existing as part of the same effort, and she gathered sod from the surrounding meadow in the cool early mornings when the grass was still wet with dew that clung to her fingers like benediction, cutting thick plugs of earth and grass with her spade, extracting them in neat rectangles, and she would examine each piece before carrying it, understanding the structure of it, the way the roots held the soil together, the engineering of nature that had been working longer than men had been thinking about such things, and she would lay her finds in piles beside her shelter, sorting them by weight and integrity, and she layered them over branches woven between the timbers in patterns that she developed through observation and adjustment, each layer offset from the one beneath it like shingles, creating a roof that would hold the heat and shed the snow when it came, that would allow water to run away rather than accumulate. And she compacted it down with the flat of the spade, pressed her boot heel into it, walked its surface to test its firmness, and the door she made from planks, salvaged from the barn's scattered remains, some still bearing the marks of the axe that had originally shaped them decades before, binding them together with strips of leather cut from an elk hide she had traded for in Pine Bluff with the last of her coins, painstaking work that required her to punch holes with a heated nail and draw the leather through like thread, her fingers pricked and bleeding by the end of it. And she hung that door on hinges, fashioned from bent iron nails and leather straps, testing its swing, listening to the creak of it. And when she closed it behind her for the first time on a late afternoon in October, when the sun was sitting low and red on the horizon, stepping into the twilight interior, where the steam rose from the cracks in the foundation stones like something alive and breathing, like the exhalation of some creature that had been sleeping beneath the ground since before the world had been ordered into its present form. She felt the temperature shift around her, like the presence of a living thing. Felt the warmth embrace her and Ingrid both. And she wept, though whether in gratitude or despair she could not have said. Perhaps some admixture of both. The recognition that she had survived not through her own strength alone, but through a collaboration between her will and the earth's inexplicable generosity, between what she had been given and what she had learned to ask for. The hot spring, which in the first days had seemed merely a curiosity, a geological accident, a small pocket of warmth in an otherwise hostile landscape, now revealed itself as something far more intricate and multifaceted as she spent time studying it in the shelter of her new home. For as she explored the foundation stones in those early weeks, moving through her shelter with increasing familiarity, learning its architecture and its secrets as if it were a language that could be deciphered through attention and patience, she discovered that the water did not rise in a single place, but emerged from several vents distributed across the foundation, each with its own character and temperature and peculiar properties, some scalding and others merely warm to the touch, some carrying a strong sulfur odor that made her eyes water, and others nearly odorless. And she set about harnessing them with the methodical patience of a woman who understands that the means of survival are not gifts, but inventions, that Providence provides the raw materials, but requires human ingenuity and labor to transform them into sustenance, requires the input of hands and mind and will. She carved a stone basin from a flat rock using another harder stone and the edge of her husband's knife, working the depression deeper and deeper across the span of many hours, her hands shaped by callus and circumstance, observing how the stone fractured and split, learning to read its grain and work with it rather than against it, understanding that if she tried to force it, the stone would shatter uselessly. But if she worked with patience and with respect for the stone's own nature, she could shape it into what she needed, until she had created a vessel perhaps 2 feet across and 6 inches deep, smooth enough in the places where Ingrid would rest that she could line it with soft moss gathered from the base of the large rocks upstream, creating a nest of comfort within the basin. And she directed one of the cooler vents into that basin through a system of carved grooves, water trickling gently into the vessel so that she could bathe her daughter in water that was warm but not dangerous, warm as blood, channeling the water through a system of carved grooves that she had spent days perfecting, learning through trial and error which angles would work, where to deepen the cuts so that water would follow them, where the surface tension would break and water would spill, and the baby would lie in that bath in the steam-filled air, her small limbs relaxing from the rigid tension of cold, her dark eyes fixing on her mother's face with the intensity of the very young observing the world that has recently become visible to them. And Maren would sing to her in Swedish, the old songs her own mother had taught her in a kitchen in Minnesota Territory so many years ago that it seemed to have belonged to another world entirely. Songs about maidens and mountains and the strange generosity of the earth. Songs that had survived the crossing of the ocean and the years of hardship. Like seeds that could not be killed, ancient melodies that seemed to carry within them the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 generations who had lived close to the stone and the soil and the water that moved through the darkness. For another of the vents, she built a kind of chimney using stacked stones that she had carefully shaped and selected, channeling the heat and moisture into a particular corner of her shelter. And above this, she placed a flat stone that she had spent an entire afternoon working smooth with river sand and water, patient, repetitive motions that steadied her mind and made the time pass without weight, her hands moving in rhythmic circles, her breathing slowing, the work becoming a kind of meditation on the nature of stone and time. And on this stone, she could bake her flatbread, laying dough mixed with whatever flour she had been able to acquire in her supply trips to Pine Bluff, flour that she rationed carefully, knowing that each trip would be more difficult as the weather worsened, and the bread would cook in the dry warmth that rose from below, developing a crust the color of old honey, and the smell of it baking mingled with the sulfur smell of the hot spring, a strange alchemy of scent that seemed to speak of the earth itself, providing sustenance, of the marriage of what lived beneath the earth and what had been provided by human industry. And when she pulled a piece of warm bread apart, she could see the steam rising from the interior, the gluten network visible like the architecture of cells, and she would give pieces to Ingrid softened in broth and watch her daughter's face as she learned the pleasure of food beyond milk, learning to chew and swallow and understand that nourishment came from the earth through her mother's hands. Winter came early that year, and with a ferocity that those in Pine Bluff had not anticipated, had not prepared for despite the warnings of old-timers and the patterns of previous years. Snow arriving in late October when the ground was not yet fully frozen and accumulating with a relentlessness that suggested the sky itself had transformed into cloud and was falling endlessly, day after day without break or mercy, and the temperature dropping so low that breath became visible as it left the body, creating a haze around a person's face, like a temporary veil between the living and the dead. And in the town the fires burned day and night, consuming wood and coal at a rate that alarmed even those who had prepared well for the winter, drawing down supplies that they had thought abundant in September, thought would carry them through until spring. And there was talk of rationing and worry visible in the set of shoulders, and the tension in the voices of people gathering to discuss provisions, discussions that were beginning to take on the tenor of desperation, but in Marin's ruin beneath the foothills, in the shelter she had constructed from the bones of the barn and the gift of the earth's heat, the temperature in the deepest chambers where the stone had been smoothed by her own hands remained steady and mild, never dropping below 50 degrees even on the coldest nights. Warm enough that Ingrid, now 4 months old and growing stout with health, round-faced and bright-eyed and developing the personality of a child secure in her comfort, could lie in her cradle wrapped in blankets without danger of freezing, without the risk of the respiratory illness that was already beginning to claim children in town, that was appearing in homes despite the best efforts of mothers to keep their children warm. Could sleep through the nights with only the sound of moving water beneath the stones and the faint hiss of steam to lull her into the profound sleep of infancy. And Marin would wake at intervals and place her hand on her daughter's chest to feel the steadiness of her breathing, to assure herself that the heartbeat was strong, and would marvel that they had been given this, that out of catastrophe had come a kind of paradise, that the man who had sought to destroy her had instead delivered her to the exact place she needed to be. Marin moved through the winter as she had learned to move through all the hard passages of her life, through her early years in the old country, where winters were merely cold and not also desperate, through her marriage to a man who had believed in the possibility of prosperity on the frontier, through his death and her grief and the theft of her homestead, without complaint, without self-pity, with the knowledge that survival was a practice that demanded constant attention and adjustment, that required of her a kind of flexibility and resilience that she did not think she possessed, but which seemed to emerge from within her when called upon, and she foraged in the frozen landscape for what remained of the year's bounty, gathering rose hips from the briars that protruded above the snow, their red hips bright as fresh blood against the white, as if the plant was still giving birth to color and nourishment, even in the depths of cold, and drying them on racks she had fashioned from twigs, spreading them in the gentle heat near the vents where they would dry without cooking, and finding the hard berries that clung to their stems, even as snow accumulated around them. Berries that had been concentrated by frost into near unbearable sweetness, requiring only a small amount to provide the tart pleasure that sustained life. And she set snares for rabbits in the places where their tracks showed they moved, using strips of leather and bent wire, working with patience and precision, understanding the pathways that rabbits favored, the places where they would pause and become vulnerable, and though many snares came up empty, found only the depression where an animal had pressed itself into the snow before escaping. Enough yielded their harvest to supplement her stores, small frozen carcasses that she would thaw carefully and butcher with the reverence that one shows toward something that has given its life to sustain her own, making every part useful, nothing wasted. And one morning in late December, walking a path she had established through the snow to a copse of trees where she sometimes found dead wood suitable for her fires, she discovered an elk, frozen where it had apparently fallen in the early snows, a great bull with massive antlers, a stroke of impossible fortune that seemed to confirm what she had begun to believe about the nature of Providence and its intentions toward her, and she understood this for the gift it was, the meat already preserved by cold, ready to be transformed into the means of continued survival, and she spent an entire day butchering it with her husband's knife, her hands numb, but working with the knowledge that her daughter's survival might depend on the efficacy of these efforts, that the work she did in the cold was a conversation with the future, and she cut the meat into strips and hung them from the roof of her shelter where the heat and air could dry them without rendering them unsafe, creating a store of protein that would sustain them through the long months remaining before spring. And the work was difficult and necessary, and it seemed to Maren as she worked that she was engaged in the oldest conversation that humans had ever had with the earth, the back and forth of taking and needing and being provided for, a dialogue written in blood and endurance and gratitude. The baby grew heavy in her arms as the weeks passed, Ingrid becoming less a fragile newborn, that creature of barely held life that she had carried away from her homestead in the autumn, and more a substantial being, her small face becoming more expressive, developing preferences and opinions, her eyes tracking movement with increasing focus and intention, and Maren understood, with a clarity that bordered on revelation, that her daughter was thriving in a way that the infants of Pine Bluff were not. For word came in that cold winter, brought by the occasional wanderer seeking shelter or supplies, or by the glimpses she could see on her supply journeys down to the town, that children in town were falling ill, coughs racking their small frames, fevers burning despite the fires that roared in their hearths, and some had not survived. And Maren felt a strange mixture of gratitude and something more complex, something that might have been bitterness or might have been a kind of hard justice, the understanding that her banishment to this ruin had become, paradoxically, a salvation, that the man who had sought to destroy her had instead delivered her to the exact place she needed to be, had forced her toward the only sanctuary that could have preserved her daughter's life. In the depths of that winter, when the snows had piled higher than the foundation stones in places, and the blizzard had howled for 4 days without cease, the wind rattling against her door and finding every crack and crevice to whistle through before being defeated by the warmth rising from within, defeated by the earth's insistent generosity, Maren wrapped Ingrid tightly in the best of her blankets, a deep blue wool that had once belonged to her husband, that still carried faintly the scent of the man she had loved, and wrapped a blanket around her own shoulders for what protection it could offer against the wind, and began the difficult walk down to Pine Bluff, the baby secured in a sling against her body, her own back bearing the weight of a pack containing pelts she had spent the autumn preparing, rabbit fur and elk hide, tanned with plant materials and her own urine, rough work but effective, the smell of them strong, even in the cold, a smell of survival and self-reliance that would mark her as someone who had learned to live outside the structures of civilization. And she moved through the white landscape with the steadiness of a woman who had already endured more than most, who had survived the unsurvivable, and found that she was still capable of love, still capable of the impulse to care for others, to see beyond her own desperate circumstances. And when she reached Pine Bluff and the residents saw her emerge from the storm, materializing out of the snow like something summoned rather than merely walking, saw her stepping into the mercantile with her daughter healthy and robust despite the season, despite the conditions, the baby's cheeks flushed with life and vitality, her eyes bright and engaged with the world around her. They ceased their conversations and watched her with expressions that mingled envy and disbelief. And Mrs. Verity Dunlap, the preacher's wife who had visited the ruin weeks earlier and found it wanting, had found Maren's pride in it incomprehensible and slightly blasphemous, as if Maren's contentment was an affront to her own careful hierarchy of worth and respectability, stood with her mouth open, staring at the child, at the mother, at the evidence of survival that contradicted everything she had assumed about the world's distribution of blessing and curse. Maren traded her pelts for flour and salt and sugar, speaking little, her eyes moving across the shelves with the methodical focus of someone who understood exactly what she needed and why, calculating in her mind the ratios and quantities that would sustain her and her daughter through the remainder of the winter. And she did not gloat, did not point to the health of her daughter or the abundance of her own small household as a rebuke to anyone, did not allow triumph or vindication to color her demeanor, but simply took her goods and turned to leave. And as she did, she met the eyes of Mrs. Verity Dunlap and held them for a moment. And in that moment something passed between them, some acknowledgement that the world was not organized as they had believed, that Providence moved in ways that the comfortable could not predict, that the universe was larger and more complex and stranger than any of them had imagined. The blizzard that had begun in the days before her visit intensified after she returned to her ruin, the winds howling down from the north with a ferocity that seemed almost conscious, deliberate, as if the storm itself had a will and a purpose and an animosity toward the human beings who thought they could claim dominion over the earth. And the snow accumulated outside her door, while inside, steam rose from the cracks in the foundation stones, and the air grew thick with moisture, and the copper braid that hung down her back grew damp with condensation. And Marin moved through her shelter with a calm born of certainty, knowing that whatever happened in the town beyond the foothills would not touch her, would not diminish the warmth that surrounded her daughter and herself. And she imagined, as she sat nursing Ingrid in the gentle heat, the baby's small hands gripping the fabric of her dress, imagined the fires of Pine Bluff burning lower and lower, the supplies running short, the panic rising in the breasts of people who had always assumed that comfort was their natural state, and that discomfort, when it came, would be brief and manageable. And she allowed herself a moment of hard satisfaction before returning her attention to her daughter's needs, to the endless practical demands of keeping them both alive and safe. The great blizzard built toward its crescendo, 7 days of storm that seemed to press against the world like something trying to crush it into dust, trying to erase the memory that anything warm or living had ever existed. And in the homes of Pine Bluff, the cold began to creep inward as fuel supplies dwindled, began to find its way past seals that were thought adequate, began to settle into corners and slowly advance toward the places where people huddled together for shared warmth. And in the fine house that belonged to Silas Venner, the coal that he had hoarded in the cellar began to run low. And when he demanded that his servant fetch more, the man simply gathered his coat and walked out into the snow and did not return, having made some calculation that involved his own life and his dignity and his sense of self-preservation, finding them more valuable than the wages Venner could offer. And Venner's wife, a thin woman named Margaret, who had never known real hardship, who had known only the comfort of her father's house and then the comfort of Venner's wealth, declared that she would go to her sister's home in the next town and would not return until spring. And so Venner found himself alone in his grand house, the fires burning lower, the rooms growing colder with each passing hour, and he sat in his study with a blanket around his shoulders and told himself that this would pass, that the blizzard could not possibly continue much longer, that by morning the sun would break through and the world would return to normal. But the sun did not break through, for the blizzard raged for another 2 days and another night, and the cold became so profound that men and women huddled around their dying fires and understood, with a clarity that came from deep within the body, a clarity that was purely animal and unmediated by intellect or hope, that they might not survive, that the temperature would continue to drop, and the fuel would continue to run out, and there was nothing they could do about it. And in the offices of the land agency, where Silas Venner kept his fraudulent papers and his careful records of the widows he had dispossessed, his meticulous documentation of theft, the documents began to curl and crack from the cold that had settled in like an occupying force, permanent and immovable, and the ink on those papers began to fade, the marks that represented theft and cruelty beginning to lose their definition, as if even the earth itself was beginning to erase the record of his crimes. On the seventh night of the blizzard, late enough that it was approaching dawn, that liminal time when the darkness had begun to thin and the world was preparing itself for light, when the wind had finally begun to diminish from its absolute fury to something merely terrible, there came a knock upon the door of Marin's ruin, a small, almost tentative knock, as if the person on the other side was not sure whether anyone would answer, whether the ruin was truly inhabited or merely a fever dream of the blizzard. When Marin opened the door, she found a young woman standing there, no more than 19 or 20, her face frost-bitten and her lips nearly white, her cheeks red from the lashing of the wind. Her own child, a boy no more than 2 years old, pressed against her chest in a sling not unlike the one Marin used for Ingrid, the child silent and unmoving with the lethargy of the nearly frozen, and without speaking, Marin pulled her inside, closed the door against the wind, felt the warmth of her shelter wrap around the newcomers like the embrace of something maternal and ancient, and began the work of thawing her slowly, carefully, rubbing her fingers and toes with her own hands, warming them against her own body, wrapping her in blankets, giving her broth and then water and then more broth. And the young woman, whose name was Sarah, had walked from a house 3 miles away, where her parents and siblings had huddled together as the cold consumed the fire. And she had determined that if she was going to die, she would at least try to find shelter, to seek refuge rather than accept freezing in place. And someone in the town had mentioned the ruin beneath the foothills, the Mad Widow's shelter, that place of impossible warmth. And so she had come, driven by desperation and something approaching faith, and now she sat in the warmth, watching this older woman move around the stone chamber with Ingrid strapped to her back, the baby sleeping despite the presence of a stranger, and Sarah understood that she had stumbled into something extraordinary, a sanctuary, a place beyond the reach of the blizzard's worst intentions, a place where the earth itself had chosen to be generous. Word spread, carried by those who managed the walk from town or who encountered Sarah's parents when they finally made it to civilization and learned where she had gone. And within 2 days, as the blizzard continued to howl and the temperature in Pine Bluff continued to drop, the fires burning out one by one as fuel was exhausted, the darkness at night absolute and complete, there were 5 people huddled in Marin's ruin, then 9, then 13, including 2 men and the preacher himself, Mr. Dunlap, who had made the journey through the snow to find his wife after she failed to return from visiting a parishioner, and who was himself nearly frozen when he arrived, his faith and his love for his wife having driven him to an act of courage that surprised him with its intensity, that revealed to him capacities he did not know he possessed. Marin organized them with a quiet authority that none of them questioned, that seemed to emerge from the very circumstance of survival, assigning sleeping places so that the heat was distributed evenly, rationing the food she had stored with the careful mathematics of one who understands that the difference between survival and death is often measured in small quantities, that a person can live on less than one imagines if that person has the will to survive, using the heat from the hot spring to warm stones that they could hold against their bodies at night, and she taught them to move slowly and speak quietly so that the cold outside would not be reminded of their presence, to breathe shallowly and conserve energy, as if the blizzard were a thing that could be convinced to leave them alone if they were sufficiently unobtrusive, as if survival were a game that required certain rules and certain deferences, and they settled into a rhythm. The days and nights measured not by the sun, which they could not see, which seemed to have abandoned them entirely, but by the heating of stones, the preparation of meals, the careful tending of Ingrid and the other young children, and the adults sat in the steaming darkness and spoke of the lives they had led before the cold came, and some of them wept, and some prayed, and some simply stared at the rising mist and contemplated the strange fortune that had delivered them to this place, the knowledge that they would be alive in spring because a woman they had mocked and dismissed had chosen mercy over vengeance. On the 8th night, when the blizzard had nearly exhausted itself, when the wind had begun to diminish and the snow to fall more slowly, its fury spent like that of an animal that has raged until exhaustion, when the fire had burned lower in Pine Bluff and death had begun to claim those who had nowhere else to go, there came another knock, harder than Sarah's knock had been, more demanding, more desperate, the knock of someone whose life hung by a thread, and when Maren opened the door, she found Silas Venner, the wire-rimmed glasses hanging broken from one ear, one lens shattered, and the metal frame bent into an improbable shape, his black suit caked with ice and torn in places, his face the color of old paper, nearly blue around the lips, his fingers blackened, and his breathing shallow and irregular, and she understood immediately that he had no idea who she was, that the cold and the darkness and the desperation of his own dying had erased from his mind any memory of the widow he had dispossessed months before, that his consciousness had narrowed to the single imperative of survival, and without speaking, she pulled him inside, closed the door, felt the warmth begin its work of redemption, began the work of thawing him as she had thawed Sarah, rubbing his hands with her own, wrapping him in blankets, giving him broth warmed by the earth's heat, and it was only as his mind began to clear and the color began to return to his face, only as he regained the ability to think beyond the animal need for warmth, that recognition kindled in his eyes, and he looked at her, truly looked at her, and understood where he was and who stood before him, understood the full weight of what she had chosen to do, and the knowledge of it seemed to strike him like a physical blow, and he could not speak, could not form words, could only sit in the warmth and understand what had happened to him, that the woman he had ruined had saved his life, that in the mathematics of survival he had become her debtor in a way that transcended coin or contract, and the knowledge of this settled upon him like the weight of stones, unbearable and absolute, a weight that would not leave him in this life or the next. The blizzard broke at dawn, the wind ceasing as if it had exhausted some ancient quota of cruelty, as if the sky itself had grown tired of its own violence, as if Providence itself was satisfied with the suffering it had permitted and had determined that enough was enough, and the sun, pale and distant but present nonetheless, a light so feeble it seemed almost to be a memory of light, began to illuminate the white landscape beyond the ruin's door, and Maren stood in the doorway holding Ingrid, her copper braid coming loose from its binding and falling down her back in a disheveled rope, her pale hazel-green eyes reflecting the light of the new day with a clarity that seemed to contain multitudes, and she looked out at the people she had saved, Sarah and her child, the preacher and his wife, the other townspeople who owed her their lives, and at the back of the group, still unable to meet her eyes, Silas Venner, reduced to his essence by cold and shame, knowing himself for what he was, a man whose cruelty had been repaid not with justice but with mercy, which he understood was a crueler fate than any revenge could have been, for revenge would have allowed him to rage and resist, but mercy demanded that he accept the truth of his own insignificance and smallness. Venner left as soon as the weather permitted, walking down to Pine Bluff without speaking to anyone, without accepting offers of company, and the shame that he carried seemed to age him, to diminish him in the eyes of those who saw him, and within a week he had closed his agency and disappeared from the territory. His fraudulent records left behind in the office, and they were eventually discovered by a federal land inspector who passed through in the spring, and hearing the story of the ruin and the widow and the great blizzard that had been broken by a woman's mercy, began to investigate the land office files with a growing sense of outrage, and found the false documentation, the forged signatures, the theft of homestead rights that should have been sacred, and he made inquiries and determined that Maren Kallstrom, widow, mother, survivor, was the rightful heir to the land upon which her ruin stood, and he granted her legal title not merely to the ruin itself, but to the surrounding acreage under a compassionate homestead provision, recognizing in her claim the kind of human persistence and integrity that the laws were meant to protect rather than destroy. Years passed, flowing like the water beneath the foundation stones, like the seasons turning above, and the ruin became less a ruin and more a home, rebuilt and extended, proper walls rising where there had been salvage, a roof of wood shingles replacing the sod and branches, windows cut to let in light but preserve heat, the interior walls smoothed and fitted, and around it a small community began to grow, drawn by the knowledge of what had happened there, by the existence of the hot spring, by the presence of a woman who had learned how to live in harmony with the earth's quiet abundance, families building their own homes nearby, children playing on the warm stones that emerged from the foundation, and one of those children was Ingrid, grown to a toddler, her copper braid identical to her mother's, running through the steam with the unself-consciousness of one born into comfort, playing games that only she understood, and Maren, now moving into her middle years, her face lined by weather and work and the strange contentment that comes from knowing oneself to be in the place one is meant to be, tended the hearth at the center of her home, fed the families who gathered there, offered shelter to those who came seeking it, asked no questions and expected nothing in return, and the warmth that rose from below, that ancient gift of the earth, that affirmation of providence working through stone and water, and the patient turning of the seasons, continued to sustain her and all those who found their way to her door, and in this way, the cold mathematics by which cruelty calculated its returns was overcome by a different arithmetic entirely, one where mercy multiplied and spread like warmth through stone, where the land's quiet gifts endured long after the men who believed they owned it had turned to dust, and where a woman's hands, shaped by suffering and work, could transform ruin into home, and make of sanctuary a kind of salvation.